now we're going to move into some of the do's and kind of what we would say. So I think you've heard from me that the core of this body trust, but we would say we would highly recommend to just support the internal regulation of our kids' bodies and do maybe your own exploration too about what you do or don't trust in your own body and figure that out also. But with our kids, to allow for them to communicate and have language and experience and express their body's cues and connect to that. You know, the video and some of the spirit is we desire for our kids to be confident, to be empowered, to be all of who they are. And I think that when we help them kind of dig into those birthright, those ways they were born, to connect to that, I think it gives them a spirit of empowerment to go into those moments that they can be at their friend's house, or they can be down the street, or they can be in our own home at our own table, and know that they can connect to themselves. And I think it's important for us to recognize where the teaching moments are around this with our kids. So I think of the summer, and we had gone to an arcade, and they won a ton of candy, and so they were working, you know, having their bags of candies in the back of the car ride on the way home. And we were tired, really, really tired. So it was kind of like, yep, have the whole bag back there, like just take it all and do with it what you want. And it was like, you know, morning, and some of the kids had had a little breakfast, some not. And I was just curious to see, like, oh, I just wonder, how will you feel, you know? And one of the kids especially expressed, oh, you know, at one point in the ride, oh, I'm feeling sick, I'm not feeling so well. I was like, oh, where do you feel that? Oh, my tummy. Oh, I wonder why. And we talked about the car ride, like motions, right? And then just like time and tired being on the trip. And then they didn't mention the candy, and I was like, oh, and you've been eating candy. I wonder what was that like, you know? And they're like, oh, you know, my kids are pretty stubborn, so they were not going to go there and connect that at all, which I love. Like, they could have a neutral perspective on that. But I said, you know, I know for me, there's been times where I've had a ton of sugar, especially on an empty stomach, and it doesn't totally feel great. Like, I'll end up kind of feeling a little not myself. So I just wonder, right? So planting a seed, but not saying that's what it is. And I think of like Colin too, who like a couple summers ago would just love lemonade, and then just like a half an hour later just like puke it up somewhere because it was way too much, right? He figured it out. I didn't need to regulate it, like he figured it out. But the whole process of how they'll figure it out can be messy, literally and figuratively.
And
so,
invoke our anxiety.
Oh yes,
Right.
yeah, and that's where I think the pushback that we get is around that of like, okay, so if I just let my kids eat whatever and listen to their bodies, I don't know, like, how will that work?
They'll just eat desserts and desserts and desserts and desserts, right?
Yeah, right. And even though I could say the research doesn't show that, like, we still have that fear, right? We would think that. So the next slide kind of talks about some of the structure that we would say. It's not just about listening to your kids' bodies and letting them just decide in all things. We have a role and some structure that we need to give to contain this and to allow for our kids to truly learn about their bodies. There is something called the division of responsibility, and there's the full handout is in the back, and you can grab that on the way out if you'd like. But Ellen Satter is a dietitian, and she is kind of the expert in family feeding and has done a lot of research and in practice clinical work around family and the way that we feed our kids and how we teach our kids about food and their bodies. And the main thing in this division of responsibility is she says, parents, you have this role, and kids, you have this role. So as parents, our main roles are the what, the where, and the when. The what, the when, and the where, okay? And then the kids decide how much they're going to eat or whether or not they're going to eat. So what does that really mean, right? So if we, I think starting with the when, there is a structure that we as parents can provide that communicates that there is always going to be food available, and they know when they're going to get it next. I think of the sweets thing. Colin, my middle guy, loves Oreos, and there's I countless times I find him in the cabinet with the Oreos out, and I'm like, oh, okay, you want some Oreos? Okay, when can we have Oreos? Like, it's not snack time yet. Like, when can we have them? Let's put them in a baggie. Let's take him to soccer. Let's have him in a snack, or let's have it right now. And yes, sometimes he has a total breakdown about it. He totally does. But if I'm in that moment saying, no, I'm not serving Oreos right now, this is not the time for Oreos, that's okay. So we can create some of that when. Now the what of parenting, that is like a huge topic. It would be a whole conversation. How do we address the what of what we bring in? And that's where I think some of our own adult relationships with food and our own preferences and knowledge and like what you might take in from society or science or your, whatever, your family about food influences what you might bring into your home. But that's up to you. But the key thing is provide neutrality around it all. So they may go to somebody else's house and have a different food selection, but when you hear about the fact they're having those other foods, That's okay. Like you just neutralize it, you say, oh, that's fun, oh, I wonder where they got that, oh, that sounds interesting, oh, you know, like you create curiosity and acceptance of that and a positive energy around it. You can still make decisions around what it is that you want to provide and when in that structure. Yeah, and I think coming back to, right, is that if the what is yours, you present things to the table, and then the when, they know that it's dinner time, and you might say, I do this often, it's like, it's dinner time, guys, and tonight we are not having a snack, so this is your time. I'm not serving any more food after this, and I make it very, very clear because I don't want to be in and out of the kitchen, and I want it to be done. And so that's a structure, and I'm giving them reassurance that the next time they're gonna eat is breakfast, or the next time is gonna be that evening snack if there's time for that tonight, if I'm saying that there is gonna be, right? But it's just really clearly communicating that schedule so that they can have reassurance. Is there anything else I should say about that?
Just that's hard. It's actually, I mean, it's a lot, it's easier in theory than it is in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, to name that, I think it's hard. And there's times that I'm like, how is this working? I mean, I would say in general, that's the way our family functions, but it also is hard. It's hard to do. Yeah.
So, and I think the next slide talks about, I would say, what then is the teaching role of the parent about nutrition and food? Do we have a role? What then do we do? I think it's really important that we think about the age appropriateness of the messages that we give our kids about nutrition, and that we do focus on joy, that the age appropriateness around about the information that we might give. So yes, we are saying have a neutral, all foods can fit in a way of feeding our body, like just having an all foods fit approach. That's what we're saying. But when you're maybe with younger kids, I think the general focus of teaching is focusing on the function of food. Okay, so much of the messages out there are about what to avoid, or what, again, inciting fear. What that might do if you have too much of it, or avoid too much, or don't have that. But thinking in the way that we might teach our kids, what are the functions? So for a young kid, I use the acronym FOOD. So F is for fuel. That's one of the reasons we eat and one thing we get from food. The oohs and ahs, so the taste and the pleasure and the enjoyment. And then the D is the delivery of nutrients, right? So the actual nutrition, the carbohydrates, the protein. So giving the kids some structure initially to go, these are the things that food give me. Great, like I can have that. Then when they're older, maybe you get into the like, oh yeah, that food has a lot of protein. What does protein do in your body? And again, focusing on the positives, like what does the body do with protein? What does the body do with fat? And not instilling the fears of maybe what we might hear from societal messages, because our body does need all foods and all macronutrients. We all do need carbs, protein, and fat.
And we can take some of the lead from our kids in terms of what they're interested in and how much information we're sharing, and you know, similar maybe to even starting some of those sex talks and things like that, of where are their interests, and maybe they are more like science oriented and are really interested in what's in a food, and maybe one of your kids could care less.
The next one that I would say is, in all the way that we talk about food or how we address food, that there would be a spirit of, let's eat. Let's have permission to eat and enjoy food. Again, there's such this fear message, and we get stuck in that spiraling because, oh, but wait, this is that. But just to kind of come back to, yes, we are eaters, we're human, therefore we eat. Like, I think it's going to be okay, and to bring in the joy of what that might be. There is one article in the back that does talk about connected eating. I think we fear that if we connect to food, if we have emotion around food, and we have a lot of good, rich experiences with food, that we're going to overdo it. We're going to overeat. We're going to feed our body too much, and we're never going to know when to stop. And actually, research shows the opposite. When we actually connect, when we actually have a full, rich experience with people and taste and that's when we can moderate it well. And the same thing for our kids. If we give them the full, complete experience around food, they can also see that there's joy in it. When we start to restrict or give them the bound, like all this stuff, that's when they might feel that shame come up, and that's when they're going to be hiding and hoarding and having some secrecy around food. We don't want that secrecy. We want them to bring their excitement about food so that then they can find out where their stopping point is and where that hunger and fullness and cueing can lead them. So
a good example, actually, that I just thought of with that is if you had, like, so for me, having kind of full permission with food, Thanksgiving then isn't really different than any other meal, except for it's another homemade meal that's really good. But it's not. I mean, I think that's the mentality when there is freedom, is then it's not this big. Yeah, it's not this big feast. Big feast where like people talk about it culturally.
Yeah. So, and that leads into celebrating and the positivity and the joy that we get from celebrating family meals. And I would say that is another really important tenet to the way that we would say approach food with your kids, is to do that. The family meal, the same Ellen Satter, who created that division of responsibility, has done a lot of research around the family meal. And she defines it this way. It's a meal when you and your family sit down together, facing one another, and share time and attention as well as food. And the whole family doesn't need to be there. So I think about, from my standpoint, where I am with my 7-year-old, 4-year-old, 11-month-old, oftentimes by the time I actually sit down to start eating, one kid's done with their food and like, can I be excused? I'm like, okay, can we just stay for like 3 minutes, maybe, and like, just please. Because we did all just have a family meal. We just had this whole effort. But while I was going up to get something, you just like scarfed a whole bunch of food down and you're done. You want to move on to the next thing. And I would say I check that family meal box really loosely. Like, I would encourage you, and that's what the research shows, is like, it doesn't need to be this like, always candles, always 25 minutes, like, no, highs and lows, like, for me, it's check the box with 3 minutes, and they're all at the table for a period of time, so.
Providing opportunities for fun physical activity. I think going back to that tenet of movement is our birthright, I think of how kids naturally are a good example of that, right? Like, we see them in the playground, we see them running around with their friends, and they're showing the ease and enjoyment. And often then as we get older, some of that relationship breaks and there's more shoulds, there's more other motives for, well, actually, I think about even with kids, when I think some of the change comes in when sports get introduced and there's more competitiveness, and kids start to be more aware of that being a value. And often some of the other needs that were met in their freedom and their ease get lost in sort of the pursuit for the outcome. And so I think, us as parents, we have an opportunity to encourage the needs being met, that a broader range of needs getting met, whether that's play, creativity, freedom, and then the modeling piece too. Like, what are we modeling about our own relationship with exercise? Is it mainly about changing the body and body shaping? What are they watching us do, and our motives for doing it, and how might we communicate that? I think of, David and I ran for UW, so running's been in our blood and our history, and it's something I really have a lot of pleasure in. It once was there was a season it was very disordered, but what am I modeling to my girls when I'm running? What are they seeing? What needs are they seeing get met? Are they seeing, I'm talking about, hey, this is social connection, I'm going with a friend, or it might be, I'm needing time to myself, this is a way to connect spiritually. Or they might be seeing, hey, I'm going to race and I want to be badass and go as fast as I can. So they're seeing kind of different needs getting met. I think I'm clearly communicating. They're not seeing it as a way to keep my body in a sculpting or keeping my body look a certain way. So, and then respecting body diversity. So again, this relates back to the health at every size principle, that we do come in all shapes and sizes, and genetics plays a pretty significant role. This is kind of what Julie was going into about the literature. If we think about our culture from a historical perspective, the thin ideal actually wasn't introduced culturally until the 1960s with Twiggy as the model. So before the 1960s, there wasn't a moral judgment around larger shaped bodies. And I think you see that reflected in kids' literature. So if you look back at the old classics, Charlotte's Web, all those old books, they use the word fat often as a neutral descriptor: fat, tall, thin, short, brown-haired. It's seen very neutrally, and then you see over time how the thin ideal has been introduced, and even things such as our toys have reflected the thin ideal. So these are better. The thinner My Little Pony, the thinner Strawberry Shortcake,
Joe's,
G.I. Joe's, so many toys have
so much more sculpted.
Right, have changed to reflect this thin ideal. And so one of the encouraging things is there is more recent movements around body positivity and reclaiming the word fat as a neutral word, as a descriptor word. But again, just how are we, like, if we think about what, I think about this, like, what are my kids seeing? What information are they taking in from TV shows? What connections are they making? What kind of questions can I ask them, for example? Even with TV, or with friends, peers at school. So why do you think a lot of kids like that girl? What do you think it is about them that makes them appealing, or that people are drawn to them? Are they going to say because she's pretty? Because she's thin? Or because she's kind? The Barbie. Sophia asked me about Barbie. Yeah. So how are they connecting? So we're kind of we're trying to help make sense of their little worlds, of what are they making connections around essentially worth and love. And I think we can do this brilliantly with asking questions and being curious. I think that's a hope a takeaway that you can leave with is having the spirit of curiosity around this. This slide is really the impetus of why this talk even happened. When I guess it was back in first grade, I had a handful of moms come up and say to me, my kid just said she's fat, or my kid just said her legs are big. What do I do? And really concerned, and understandably so. Like, how do I engage these conversations? I guess also similar to what I just was saying about having a curious stance of seeing these as these precious opportunities to engage your kid in conversation. So I would say developmentally around the first grade is when kids are more aware of their body and they're comparing themselves to other people and trying to make sense of it. It's not loaded. Like if they're going to say I'm fat, it's not like an adult saying I'm fat. They're using language trying to make sense of how their body works. And so, for example, if a parent said, which is pretty normal for a parent to be like, oh no, you're not fat. One, it's implying that fat is bad, or that you wouldn't want to be fat. And two, you're kind of you're stopping the conversation because you're saying, oh, you're not that, so conversation over. And I guess I would encourage that's an opportunity to ask questions. And I can give a great example. It happened to me last year, I think. Sophie and I were sitting on a bed and our legs were up, and she said, my thighs are fat, or she said, oh, my thighs are fat. She didn't say it with judgment, but she said it, and so we got in this probably 15-minute conversation. I mean, she just kept going with it. It was fun. We talked about, I was helping her with some language. We talked about genetics. We talked about David's body and my body and Hannah's and how we're similar and different. I used it as an opportunity to give some more words for her to describe what she was noticing. It's neat to see then some of the ways she brings neutrality when she makes observations about appearance. So, and another point of that is often kids are noticed when anxiety is present. And so even that, if we can have those conversations with some ease and curiosity and neutrality, I think it's laying a foundation for future when it gets worse. And obviously kids are cruel, and there is fat prejudice, and there is a lot of fat shaming. But if we can set some of that tone and foundation of them understanding what makes bodies different, then we can help them navigate the really tough times when kids use it for cruelty and there's fat shaming involved. I mean, I truly believe, and I'm so grateful, I truly believe my kids will have a foundation understanding of bodies just being different from a genetic standpoint. So then then we're dealing with cruelty when it comes into if they get teased and bullied, which we haven't had to face yet.
And I think one of the other pieces that we think of, and this is obviously we're expecting that most of you have kids that are more in the elementary age, but we think about puberty. And we'll probably do a new talk at that time about what does that mean? But I think one of the seeds to plant is just that it is so normal for a significant weight gain to happen. They say for girls it's about 40 pounds, and for boys it's like that they would gain about 50% of what their mature adult weight would be during puberty. These are both significant amounts, and so we, in our culture, weight gain has a negative stigma, and it kind of elicits a reaction, and I need to do something about it. And I think to kind of go into puberty and into the way that our kids' bodies will change and be open to the fact that, okay, let's be patient. Again, this body works. This body's going through some changes. Let's see what happens to it. Let's see what's really going to evolve over time, and take a step back to continue with that neutrality and that trust their body is going to work it out to be what the body is supposed to be in those changes. So. And
we realize so many people are not giving that message, right? Mm-hmm. So especially if you think of the medical field, kids going into going to see their pediatricians. I mean, one of the first recommendations from a doctor is to lose weight. I mean, that is one of the most common recommendations, and they are linking weight with health. So we're very aware of that, right? So I think it goes back to what are kids learning from us as their teachers, and then how do they navigate other information that could be really confusing, and how do you do that age appropriately? I mean, it's all tough. This is tough. Yeah. And really, I feel really hopeful, and I think even when I think of a lot of these young adult women that we've worked with, that have been a lot raised in families where this cultural discourse is what they've known and heard just seeing some of their response to, and their brain plasticity working, and some of their response to seeing this alternative. And they're here because they've seen over and over that this hasn't worked, and it's brought pain, and it's brought suffering. And they've really lost their life in a lot of ways, right? Because they're fixated, their brain and their life has become consumed about food and body image. And so to watch them go through that journey and see that there is this other way, and the freedom that comes from that, and the opened up mental space that comes from that, is really encouraging and hopeful, and why we care about this so much.